Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna sit back.
Welcome back, all you citizens of the world, to Live from the Heartland for the week of August 22nd. And for our next guest, we're going across the pond, the great blue waters, over to England. And the reason being is while I was visiting with my good friend Ewan Haig, Associate Dean and Geography Professor at DePaul, we were talking about Indian Boundary Park and Potawatomi Park. And he informed me that the street Walcott is named after the Indian agent from some middle, late 1800s on. And so we were just talking native history here in Chicago, and he told me about a friend, a fellow named Max Samson, now living in England, formerly here in Chicago at DePaul, who has a book out called The Earth Shapers, and it features a chapter on indigenous Chicago. So looking into it, I saw that he explores how we mold the world around us, how, as we etch our needs onto the natural landscape, we alter the course of history. So we thought it'd be great to have him on the show, and here he is. Hello to you, Max Samson.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be on your podcast today, on your video.
Well, your new book, you've had a few books out, and we'll get to that, but your new book called The Earth Shapers, tell us a little bit about it, what it's all about, what you're doing in it.
Yeah, my concept of earth shaping for this book, which is coming out later this year, I should say, in the US with the University of Chicago Press, so also very local to you, of course, currently now out in the UK with Profile Books. My concept of earth shaping describes humans' constant desire to mold and remold the planet according to our needs and desires, with the ultimate goal of making it more interconnective. The Panama Canal would be a classic example, and is actually an example I use in this book, of humans deciding that the natural environment isn't quite fit for purpose or doesn't quite suit humans' needs, and so modifying the Earth quite substantially in the case of the Panama Canal as a result. And in time, connections such as this, such as the Panama Canal, become so familiar, so normal, that we can easily forget that they were in fact created by humans. It was us who actually made them in the first place. But I'd like to say also that earth shaping, as I show in this book, isn't just about these quite blatant modifications of the environment, and it isn't the exclusive preserve of political elites. In fact, in one way or another, we are all earth shapers. Some of the inspiration for the book I'm a runner, came from looking at desire paths, those sorts of trails of erosion we see almost everywhere, where people have kind of drawn a shortcut in some way. People have kind of gone over the same grassy area, for example, repeatedly, and creating these kinds of new routes, which become again, so normalized, we forget easily that they weren't actually planned. So earth shaping occurs in that kind of way. It also occurs more conceptually. I'm thinking about things such as ley lines, spiritual pathways, spiritual routes, and I have a couple of examples of that in my book as well. So yeah, kind of a lot of different ways, essentially, in which humans have modified the world around us in order to suit particular needs and desires and preferences.
Let me ask you, when people reshape their environment, what are some of the dangers of that, and what are the advantages of that?
Yeah, and you're right to say, to mention kind of dangers of it, in the sense that, like any modification or any kind of activity, really, there are going to be multiple sides of the argument. There are going to be different unseen ramifications. So I'm trying to think of a good example that I use. I mean, the Chicago one is a good example, which I think we'll discuss a bit more later, about how Euro-American settlers to the Midwest essentially co-opted the existing indigenous pathways that existed in ridges as well as in waterways, with the quite well-known, I think, Chicago portage, and converted these into modern transport routes, such as roads, such as canals in order to create waterways more suited to their purposes, and in this way actually have helped to disenfranchise the original inhabitants of the region. There's all sorts of interesting ways in which things get seen differently over time as well. One of my favorite examples is from the Korean peninsula, where for over a millennium there's been this belief in what's called Pringsu-juri. It's called geomancy. It's essentially the Korean version of feng shui, where people have sort of modified and built cities in particular locations based upon vital energy flows, and this belief that vital energies flow through the earth. And with different political elites in Korea over the centuries, as well, most notably during the Japanese occupation in the early 20th century, there remains a lot of kind of anger as to how sometimes these vital energies have potentially been undermined, have been weakened through the act of actually transforming them into something new, again, such as transport infrastructure, such as dams and all sorts of things which can sort of break the flows. So it's a very political kind of issue, and a lot of my book deals with the politics and the changing perceptions about all of these connections that we see across the world. And I use examples from all sorts of different continents.
Well, Max Samson, when you mentioned Chicago, and you mentioned the like basically the Native American grid and the streets we have like Ridge and Clybourne, which are diagonal and were continue to be used to this day, but they started a long time ago. Talk a little bit more about indigenous Chicago and what you discuss about it in your book.
Yeah, and I believe you're in Rogers Park, which
we are,
if I'm not mistaken, which is a really interesting neighborhood to study these kinds of things. And I think, an important thing for me to do in Earth Shapers, as well as in my first book, Invisible Lines, was to try and draw attention to things in the landscapes around us, which we can easily overlook. So in the case of Chicago, it's a long history, of course, that I could provide. If I were just to sort of use a bit of a shorthand with the time available, for generations, the land that Chicago sits on was settled really only seasonally by a variety of different indigenous groups, including the Potawatomi, one of the more well-known groups, I'd say, but certainly not limited to the Potawatomi. Also Ojibwe, Adara, Illinois, Miami. And essentially what would happen is these groups met in Chicago, or what became Chicago, because Chicago sits at the intersection of a number of different narrow ridges of unconsolidated debris, which had been deposited by retreating glaciers well in the past. And so these ridges would converge at the point that we call Chicago today. They were rather unassuming, the ridges. They'd be just 5 feet wide, usually at most, no more than about 12 feet high. But they still provided this very natural and logical means of reaching this same area across these poorly drained wetlands, which is true of most of the natural geography of the kind of southwestern edge of Lake Michigan. So indigenous groups basically didn't need to really modify the earth very much. They had much more, and still do have much more of a kind of stewardship relationship with the natural world, kind of tending to it, recognizing that humans and nature should work together. So through a spiritual understanding, recognizing that there's one unified system of humans and other natural beings, and that humans should accordingly adapt themselves to the environment rather than adapting the environment to their own preferences. And this remained essentially the status quo for centuries. It wasn't until the mid-18th century, I believe, that we think a Potawatomi community actually established a permanent village on the Chicago River. This was just a temporary meeting point. The other aspect which made Chicago a really popular destination or meeting point for indigenous communities was the fact that it suited to portaging, whereby a person could carry or haul a canoe across a relatively small, short distance across different, between different bodies of water. So in this case, you get from Lake Michigan into one of the rivers to the west, across just this kind of muddy area by just pulling your canoe along. And this enabled people to travel between otherwise disconnected rivers and lakes. And so the Chicago portage was a well-regarded crossing point for that reason for indigenous communities. And when the first settlers came from other places, such as Marquette and Joliet, French visitors to the area, they learned about these connections. They learned about them. They were introduced to the portage, for example, and found that an expedient way of getting from one place to another. So this originally, and for a long time, was how people would work with the natural surroundings. It was only later, talking the turn of the 19th century, where this kind of reciprocal, cooperative relationship between humans and the natural environment began to be really supplanted by a more human-centric approach, which was more about, in the first instance, carving up the land for the purpose of permanent settlement and profit-making. New treaties were signed in order to gradually displace indigenous communities from the area. And then Chicago, was established in the 1830s and practically overnight morphed into this metropolis, at one point the fastest growing city in the world. So the reason why Chicago actually was settled by Euro-Americans owes largely to the fact that indigenous groups had already shown a way to deal with a place which is marshy, it's wet, it has very extreme climate, of course, incredibly cold in the winter, very hot in the summer, not an easy place to settle. But indigenous people showed that you could actually live here and that it was a logical transport hub, which of course it then later became, whether for railways, whether for intermodal transport, and of course later with Chicago O'Hare in terms of air travel as well. So, a huge amount of change took place. I'm thinking of just how the road development, Chicago is quite well known for its grid system, but if you look at a map of Chicago, you can see these winding trails, which sort of go against the flow, essentially, of the grid. These winding roads are almost all former indigenous trails, not all of them, but almost all of them are basically where the land is slightly higher than the wetlands below. And so indigenous groups had shown that if you travel along these ridges, such as Ridge Boulevard and Ridge Avenue in the far north of Chicago, you can kind of traverse across the marshy ground. And so this became actually part of the original plan for designing the city. It was like a blueprint, essentially, for designing the city. When the Chicago Sanitary Canal, Shipping Sanitary Canal, and before that, actually, the Illinois and Michigan Canal were built. The Illinois and Michigan Canal was directed straight across the portage. This was seen again as a logical place to connect two waterways. So taking this natural connecting point and turning it into a faster canal, which could be used to transport bulkier goods, essentially, between New York and New Orleans, or even beyond if you so wanted. So in both of these ways, and there were other ways which I show in the chapter as well, the white settlement of Chicago was actually following this model and this blueprint that had been already recognized and identified and used and valued by indigenous communities for a lot longer. So kind of a huge amount, I think, of just seeing how these connections can be changed and modified, and some of the traumas that can come with this as well are what I'm interested in exploring in this book.
I spent a good number of years living in Uptown, which had a sizable Native population in the American Indian Center. The American Indian Center has moved to the northwest in the city or nearby, and actually, I think that the Native population in Chicago has probably diminished. But I also, I know, and I'm sure you know, that Jean Point de Sable was the first settler, and he was African descent. And, recently the city renamed Lakeshore Drive the Jean Point de Sable Lakeshore Drive, which was some acknowledgement to our Native history. But I'm wondering if you could share how the city has commemorated or failed to commemorate its indigenous communities' contributions.
Yeah, and I think the renaming of Lakeshore Drive after DeSable is a great example of it. And this is more me anecdotally, and I realize I've been away from Chicago for a couple of years now, but I've never been really aware of many people still, really calling it the DeSable Lakeshore Drive. I tend to feel people still use the shorthand, just LSD.
It's starting to shift. I mean, I know in my own thing, I'm going Jean Point DeSable Lakeshore Drive, because I like the change, but it's still LSD.
Yeah, and that's the thing. These things do take time, and there are all sorts of interesting debates, I think, around Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as the fact that, Chicago, of course, has a Columbus Drive right in the center of the city. And, you mentioned about this kind of memorialization or commemoration of indigenous groups in particular versus other groups. And, I think Chicago certainly still does largely adhere to a kind of more Euro-American model in general. So I find it quite interesting, for example, and this goes beyond it, that Italo Balbo, who was basically Mussolini's right-hand man, has a street named after him, again, fairly downtown, kind of edge of the South Loop. And yet a figure like Kitahara, which is DeSable's indigenous wife, I don't believe has anything named after her at all. And the DeSables, in many ways, I think, would be a kind of almost a model of an alternative American couple in some ways. This kind of multilingual, multi-ethnic, couple who would liaise with all sorts of people, with immigrants, with fur traders, with other indigenous groups, and so on. And in many ways, I think embodied this kind of very inclusive alternative to what we might see as, a largely white Euro-American kind of white, kind of American identity. You asked anyway about commemoration, and I should have talked more about Rogers Park. I think Rogers Park is a great example of this. So Rogers Park, going north to south, you've got Ridge Boulevard, you've got Clark Street, both form indigenous trails. Clark Street is named after the military officer George Rogers Clark, who was the brother of the famed explorer William Clark of Lewis and Clark westward expansion fame. So Clark Street, immediately we can see named after a white explorer, or rather his brother, military officer, who was unfortunately, infamous for persecuting indigenous people, George Rogers Clark. He was known and quite notorious for his violent treatment of indigenous groups. So it's quite a statement to name the main street, or one of the two main streets, after this figure. In terms of Rogers Park, we also have, just going from the lake, kind of southwest inland, a road which is a diagonal but wasn't actually an indigenous trail, is actually named after, it's been renamed a few times, but it was turned from Indian Boundary Road because it was the boundary that was drawn and established as part of the 1816 Treaty of St. Louis, which prohibited indigenous people from living near the Chicago River. So back in 1816, this road was named after that, and then was later renamed to Rogers Avenue in honor of the Irish-born settler and landowner Philip Rogers, who also gives his name to Rogers Park. So again, we have this kind of hint of indigenous history, or an aspect which is really important in many ways to indigenous people, the boundary which prevented people from, the Potawatomi community here, from living anywhere close to Chicago. That history has sort of been whitewashed and replaced with a rather more, I guess, kind of innocuous seeming, name in the sense of just a local landowner. And then if you follow it further along, you get various other neighborhoods and various other parts of the city which are named sometimes for Indian boundary, sometimes other things. Just thinking, kind of getting a bit further along. This is testing my memory of Chicago roads a little bit. But if you follow it, further along Rogers Avenue, you get to West Ridge, so a different community area, which has Potawatomi Park, as well as Indian Boundary Park. So this time we do actually have indigenous communities are named or recognized.
We recently saw the Columbus statue taken down, and it's of course been an issue. But you kind of inspire me to talk up changing the name of some streets.
I think there was actually a suggestion from one of the aldermen a few years ago to rename Columbus Drive. I'm trying to remember what it was. It might have been after Obama. That was proposed, I think, but clearly hasn't happened.
Well, we'll see what happens. You know, you have another book out too that it's called Invisible Lines. Let's shift to that and tell us a little bit about what that's all about.
Sure, yeah. So Invisible Lines is about the unseen boundaries. We already talked a bit about the Indian boundary. I'm interested in boundaries, but specifically I'm looking at these quite usually unofficial boundaries, which we all imagine and which affect how we engage with our surroundings. So some of my examples in that book are about how invisible lines have helped us to actually understand the world around us. One of my first example is called the Wallace Line, which is so named. It's the line which runs essentially through what is now Indonesia, and it separates where you would find kind of Australian, I'm doing this in square quotes, Australian animals from Asian animals. So it's basically why we get marsupials essentially in Australia and Eastern Indonesia, but we don't get them, or most of them, any further west. And likewise, you won't find like monkeys indigenous to Australia. So, understanding this, the kind of very mysterious line which just goes through the Indonesian archipelago is something which helps us understand actually evolution through natural selection. And it was created at the same time as Darwin was doing his research on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin actually published on the origin of species faster than he wanted to, because he wanted to be the one to get the credit for it. So that's one example. But there are others which came about in part because I wrote it while I was in lockdown in Chicago. This experience of invisible lines kind of directing me, the fact that we had to imagine like a 6-foot radius around ourselves, kind of thinking about what is the invisible line that I can kind of, how far can I go in one direction or another? Some of them are about things like redlining, so lines that have been drawn in order to define who is allowed or can access a mortgage in different places. There are different kinds of forms of segregation, which we often do see through invisible lines. Some are about, you might think about like school districts and so forth, or about why do people use certain words in certain parts of the country but not in others? Where do we draw the line where people might say y'all or you all, or in Pittsburgh's case, yins? I have kind of more detailed examples of this than just that, and some which might seem a little bit less trivial. But I think it's interesting to consider these kinds of unseen boundaries and how they actually do direct a huge amount of how we live our lives. And that comes down to geopolitics too. It's something I talk about in the epilogue with respect to Russia and Ukraine. Now, very quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but if I were to mention this in the case of Rogers Park, just to try and keep with our theme, I don't know how many viewers or listeners will be familiar with the concept of an Eruv, which is a strictly Orthodox Jewish boundary. It's used essentially to convert private spaces into a public space for the purposes of, public space into private spaces for the purposes of undertaking or kind of circumventing different rules on Shabbat, on the Jewish Sabbath. So essentially, if you're strictly Orthodox Jewish, you are forbidden from carrying objects from a private to a public domain, which is a bit of a dilemma if you want to go to synagogue, which you probably do, because you can't carry your keys, you can't carry like your prayer book, all sorts of things like that. So an Eruv is a way in which different wires and other parts of the existing landscape are converted into an invisible boundary, which makes all of the territory in that boundary, in that enclosure, private space just for Shabbat. And so you're basically not leaving the private space when you leave your house. And Rogers Park actually has an example of this. It's I don't know how many people know it. It's something I like to talk to my students about at DePaul, because Lakeview also has its own Eruv, which actually one of the boundaries of it is Fullerton Avenue, which is where the DePaul Lincoln Park campus is. Rogers Park has one of these Eruvim, as they're called, and it just enables strictly Orthodox Jewish people to practice their faith as desired, but most other people don't even know they exist. I don't think many people know, for instance, that almost all of Washington, D.C., is in an Eruv. So if you go to the White House, you go to the Capitol, anywhere like that, you're actually standing in an Eruv. Almost all of Manhattan is in an Eruv, and a huge amount of Los Angeles is in an Eruv. So they're really interesting. And Rogers Park is one of these places which enables strictly Orthodox Jewish people to essentially practice their faith because it has this kind of invisible enclosure.
Max Samson, I want to thank you for coming on. Your new book, Earth Shapers, which does feature a chapter on indigenous Chicago, will be released this fall, University of Chicago Press. Thanks so much for coming on. Hopefully we get to meet you in person